everyone, my name is Madisyn Kleinfelter, and for my senior seminar capstone project, I decided to talk about hydrothermal vents and specifically the symbiotic relationships between hydrothermal vent organisms.
There's another world beneath the ocean surface. Come join us as we explore the depths below. The earth cracks open. Fluid and minerals spew from the seafloor. Water shimmers. Life abounds. We're looking at hydrothermal vents, originally discovered near the Galapagos Rift in 1977. Basically, a hydrothermal vent is a hot spring produced by underwater volcanoes or tectonic activity. But what's really cool about them is the abundance and assortment of life that exists there. It's not life like we're used to up here on the surface. It's adapted to the dark conditions of the deep ocean. Organisms that live around hydrothermal vents don't rely on sunlight and photosynthesis. Instead, bacteria and archaea use a process called chemosynthesis to convert minerals and other chemicals in the water into energy. This bacterium is the base of the vent community food web and supports hundreds of species of animals. What kinds of animals? Well, scientists on the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer went to the rift in 2011. And here's just some of what they saw. Riftia tubeworms, also called giant tubeworms, which can grow to their full size of almost 5 feet long in less than 2 years. Bathymodilus deep sea mussels, which are often the first creatures to colonize the vent, and are able to survive for a short time after the vent is inactive. Serpulid, or feather duster worms, and Tevnia tubeworms, which are often the food of choice for vent crabs, the top predator of the vent community. But it's not all animals down there. Researchers also saw white flocculent material erupting from the vents like a snowblower, an indicator of microbial life beneath the seafloor. And of course, there were fresh lava flows, which means the seafloor is continuing to change. And that change means there's always more to learn. So join us as we continue to explore the depths below.
So just to get started, what exactly are hydrothermal vents? These vents are normally found on plate boundaries around the world, typically convergent or divergent plate boundaries. So just a little refresher, convergent plate boundaries is where subduction occurs, such as the Marianas Trench. Divergent plate boundaries are where new crust is being formed, such as the mid-ocean ridge. And these vent systems have also been found along transform faults, such as the San Andreas Fault up in the western United States. So here is a global distribution map of all the hydrothermal vents, which is very cool because originally we had not thought any of them had existed. So just for examples, the different shapes show different active zones, such as the mid-ocean ridge or Alp volcanoes, simply how the vents are formed. So here is the mid-Atlantic ridge over here. The active ones are in red, unconfirmed are in yellow, since these vents can die. Here's the Juan de Fuca Ridge, which is off the western coast of the United States, and also Canada, right along the San Andreas Fault, which is a transform fault. And right over here, this is where the Marianas Trench is. This is where subduction is occurring, and so these vents are formed there. So how are hydrothermal vents formed now that we know where they are formed? So this is done by really cold ocean water sinking down into the cracks of the ocean floor, and this water is rapidly heated by the Earth's mantle, and because of all this pressure And very high heat, metals and other chemicals become highly concentrated, and eventually they will shoot up and form a vent. So here is a better diagram of how this occurs. Let me get my pen. There we go. Okay, so we have this very cold ocean water here at 2 degrees Celsius, which is actually 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And this water seeps down into the crust. It's shown over here. And this very hot magma over here is 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very hot. And as this cold water is heated, it pushes up out and it precipitates and forms these vents. And from this, all the precipitate is found out here, and it eventually falls back down into the seafloor. Now, here's a video describing more in detail about how these vents are formed.
Not too long ago, scientists studying the ocean made a fascinating discovery that has helped us better understand our planet Earth. Down in the deep and dark waters, they found hot springs on the ocean floor, releasing hot and mineral-rich fluids. These are called hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents are often associated with undersea volcanoes. This is because the vents are created and sustained by the heat of volcanic activity at tectonic plate boundaries found throughout the globe. At these locations, seawater seeps through the cracks in the seafloor and is heated by molten rock. This causes chemical reactions between the two, and the altered seawater becomes hydrothermal fluid. This hot fluid then jets back into the ocean, forming a hydrothermal vent. Despite the seemingly harsh volcanic environment, these vents are actually home to a variety of life. Microbes such as bacteria and archaea live here, harvesting chemical energy from the hydrothermal fluid. These microbes form the base of a unique food chain that includes tube worms, shrimp, and even crabs that live in communities around the vents. It's hard to find vents and active volcanoes in the deep ocean. To do so, scientists can use a CTD instrument package that measures the conductivity, temperature, and depth in the ocean. Changes in temperature and the cloudiness of the water may be a sign of a hot spring site or erupting underwater volcano.
So, why are these hydrothermal vents so important? They act as a natural plumbing system, and it transports lots of heat and chemicals from the interior of the earth. This also helps regulate global ocean chemistry, and it also contains a lot of valuable minerals and metals that can be extracted for consumer use, which is obviously very important to our economy. Okay, so now to the more important part of this presentation. What kind of organisms are found at hydrothermal vents? All of this is relatively new since vents were only discovered, like the video said, in 1977 at the Galapagos. So as of 2000, there were only 20 different types of organisms known to live around vent chimneys, which really isn't a lot. And since they're relatively new, we thought that they were devoid of life, and we obviously now know that is not the case. Now we know that thousands upon thousands of individuals live just on one vent. One paper that I had read previously said that in one grab, they can grab almost 50,000 different mussels just in one grab of a vent, which is really cool. So, since the discovery in 1977, over 500 new species have been found at hydrothermal vents, which is complete opposite of what scientists once knew. So that is why hydrothermal vents are so important to study, because they're completely redefining what we thought or where we thought organisms could live. So, how do they vary across the world? So, it's not really known how different vent organisms are distributed. Research has shown that different organisms, such as tube worms, can survive in the open ocean. Their larvae can, but this dispersal of larvae might be a key factor in the uniformity. Since these vents have such harsh conditions, we aren't really sure how or why there aren't different types of organisms, but we can confer that since there are very harsh conditions, that typically the same organisms are going to live in that general area. So, what are some of the conditions of hydrothermal vents? So, typically they're between 400 to 750 degrees Celsius, which is a whopping 750 to 1,382 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very, very hot. And no living organism had ever been able to withstand those types of temperatures. There are obviously very, very high pressures from the water sinking down and being heated so rapidly. And the water is also extremely acidic. So the pH has been found in different vent hoods to be around 1. And typically they range between 1 and 3, and 3 is close to vinegar. So you can obviously imagine it's very acidic. And again, we had no idea that organisms could live in these type of environments. And also, vents consist of many minerals, including calcium sulfate, sulfides of copper, iron, and zinc, and just very heavy metals that obviously would hurt organisms if they lived in those areas. So here's some of the problems. So obviously microbes and all eukaryotic cells can't survive in temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius because they become very unstable. And their three-dimensional structures of enzymes and proteins are lost at temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius. So obviously there's a huge difference between 70 degrees and 400 degrees Celsius. And this can also denature the double helical structure of DNA, which obviously can have very harmful effects, usually death. And there's also a wide variety of metabolites that are rapidly hydrolyzed at temperatures above 90 degrees Celsius. And what I mean by that is that as they are hydrolyzed, they break down. It's the breakdown of a compound by a chemical reaction with water. So obviously that isn't very good for organisms to live in. So how do organisms live in the harsh conditions? Some of these communities inhabit sulfide-rich habitats because of a detoxification mechanism that they have evolved that often include microbial symbionts, which is what I'm going to get to later. This molecule is generally highly toxic, the sulfide, and to aerobic life forms, but somehow these populations of organisms flourish in this environment. So typically, only extremophiles live there. Um, they are able to live in very harsh conditions, and aerobic means using oxygen. So none of these organisms use any oxygen, which is very different from what we on land use. So most of these hydrothermal vents don't rely on sunlight. There is no sunlight, so they can't photosynthesize. So instead, most of them chemosynthesize, and this is typically the bacteria and the archaea that convert the minerals and other chemicals in the water into energy. And this bacterium is the base of the vent community food web and supports hundreds of species of animals. So here's another video uh, describing more in detail about chemosynthesis.
These scientists are headed 300 miles off the Galapagos Islands to a place known as 86 West. But the ultimate destination is a mile and a half below the ocean waves. There on the seafloor is an unexpected oasis, fountains of warm water, and basking in it, bizarre animals. Biologist Tim Schenck from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and geologist Steve Hammond from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, are the chief scientists on this expedition. They are on a mission, backed by the National Science Foundation and NOAA, a mission to explore a mystery that began a generation ago. In February of 1977, National Geographic Explorer-in-Residence Bob Ballard and a team of scientists were sailing off the Galapagos Islands when they spotted them. Hydrothermal vents, and all around them, alien creatures the likes of which had never been seen.
We had thought prior to that discovery that all life was based upon the energy of the sun through the process of photosynthesis, that the sun was the life-giving power to Earth. Well, here was a system that was living independent of the sun. It was living in total darkness, not drawing its energy from the sun, but from the Earth itself through a process we now call chemosynthesis.
In chemosynthesis, bacteria absorb chemicals in the vent water to make organic carbon, or food.
The discovery of these ecosystems in the hydrothermal vents was very important because it told us that life can thrive, not just grow a little bit, but actually thrive in the absence of light.
This initial encounter with this new exotic world was not enough. Ballard and others would come back to the Galapagos again 2 years later in 1979. This time they found a vent neighborhood, more abundant than the first. They called it the Rose Garden. Scientists believe the only way to really understand these alien worlds is to visit them again and again.
Imagine if you just saw a wintertime somewhere and you saw trees without leaves, right? And you came back a year later in wintertime and you saw trees without leaves, you would say, trees never have leaves, right? But if you come back in the spring and in the summer and in the fall, you'll see that these things become full of leaves, the leaves change and then they fall off, and there's a dynamic biological process that goes on, and it's that sense of understanding that we have yet to have at vents, understanding event animals, and that's what we have to do.
So from that awesome video, we come to endosymbiosis. This is the hypothesized process by which prokaryotes give rise to the first eukaryotic cells. So basically what they thought happened in order to create eukaryotic cells, which are our cells, is that a prokaryotic cell pretty much engulfed another one, and they started to have different ways of doing things and doing specific tasks. So the definition of endosymbiosis is one organism living in another. So this is pretty much intercellular mutualist. So the endosymbionts live in the host, and the host would not be able to live in these diverse places without them. And they can often be passed from parent to offspring, or they can be obtained from the environment. Not all endosymbionts are beneficial, most of them are, but for example, parasites are also endosymbionts because they're living in their hosts. So this is how most of the organisms at the vents live. So one of the main organisms that do this, there are many, but typically everybody knows this one. It's a giant tube worm, and with a scientific name of Riftia pachyptila. And they have bacteria that live in them that allow them to live in these environments. So tube worms have an abundant respiratory hemoglobin present in the plume, which is shown right here. This big red exterior part that sticks out. And since it's red, because it's red, it has high hemoglobin, which is what binds to oxygen and sulfide to disperse throughout the rest of the tube worm. The blood transports this respiratory hemoglobin with the tightly bound sulfide throughout the rest of the organism, and then the symbiotic bacteria that live in the tube worm allow for the occurrence of chemoautotrophy, which is a type of chemosynthesis. So colonies of this Riftia, or the tube worms, are anchored into the rocks that are the precipitate of the hydrothermal vent. So at the base of their tubes, it's enriched in hydrogen sulfide and also carbon dioxide, but there's no oxygen. So they need oxygen to survive. That's why they have this hemoglobin. So it's interesting to know that the respiratory plume is extended into the water and not where the sulfide is, where the sulfide needs to go to the bacteria. So they do live in an environment, so the sulfide is actually in the soft sediment. So it's hypothesized that they acquire this sulfide through a thin extension that goes into this sediment. So instead of taking the sulfide across that bright red plume that I showed you that you can see in this picture here, they transport it through the body wall actually from the sediments. So here's another diagram, just a little simpler, more simple version. So here is where that red plume is, which sucks in oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide from the water. And you have the heart, the vessels, and here is the trophosome, which is very important. So the trophosome is where all of these symbiotic bacteria live. And you can see that it's very close to the capillaries where the blood is flowing, so that sulfide that is attached to their hemoglobin with the oxygen can readily get to these bacteria. So just another couple of other endosymbionts at hydrothermal vents. So you have the vent clam, and they get their nutrition from sulfur oxidizing bacteria that are in their gill tissues. And another example are the very abundant mussels. So they actually have the ability to filter feed, but then they also have microbial symbionts located in their gills just as an extra buffer for energy. So now that we have talked about where hydrothermal vents are, what kind of organisms live there, and how they live there, Now we're going to talk about what happens after an event dies. So research has been done on colonies that have just died, and they have found that iron oxidizing bacteria has been found there. So organisms that live on hydrothermal vents use sulfur and not iron. We typically think of rust when we think of iron. So, for example, if the chemical makeup of the water were to change, extremophiles are not good at adapting very quickly since they're so specialized in their already diverse environment. So, these iron oxidizing bacteria are obviously causing a lot of iron to be put into the environment. They have also found that strong relationship between the geochemical energy and the organisms that use that energy could cause a event to die. So some of the solutions to hydrothermal vents dying is they have found microbes have been found to flourish after a vent dies, such as the iron oxidizing bacteria. And like I'd said before, many organisms have evolved a mobile larva that has been recorded up to 38 days in the tube worms to find either another vent or a more unstable environment. So just some application on why these vents are important and actually why we should care. So like I said before, hydrothermal vents continue to redefine how and where organisms can survive on Earth. This has caused scientists to look what it means extraterrestrially, such as organisms and microbes living on different planets in different galaxies. And they have also studied these organisms to expand how life first took hold. They think that from hydrothermal vents, that is where life first took place, since it is such an extreme environment, and how they have slowly evolved on our planet as well as where it might exist elsewhere, again, extraterrestrially. In addition, previously unknown enzymes, molecules, and different metabolic processes discovered in these extremophiles on hydrothermal vents offer potential for development into biomedical and commercial applications. So, for example, obviously, all of these metals that are found after they precipitate out of the vents can be harvested and used for consumer use or for other uses. They've also found that enzymes from vent microbes are being used to enhance the flow of oil. So, if you were to enhance the flow of drilling from deep reservoirs, there might be less damage to the surrounding environment. So, it would be less invasive, but it could also mean that if an accident were to occur, such as the Deep Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico, that more oil would be introduced into the environment. So it does have plus and minuses. And probably the best part is that they've found isonucleating proteins in these deep sea organisms that are used to make ice cream. And who doesn't love ice cream? So I really hope that you enjoyed learning about hydrothermal vents and what they're all about and how these different endosymbionts and the way organisms live in this environment can really expand our knowledge about life in other forms and different places. So here are my sources for the internet and also my published articles published articles that you will be able to see at the end when this is posted. Thank you.